Hello everyone and welcome to Amanpour and Company. Here's what's coming up. Will the upcoming Philippines presidential election replace one strong man with another? A special report on what's at stake. Then,
this is the authoritarian nostalgia that we see all around the world, and now in the Philippines, the chicken are coming home to roost.
What the return of the Marcos dynasty could mean. My conversation with Filipino writer and political analyst Richard Heydarian. Also ahead, how the Supreme Court's draft ruling on Roe v. Wade could hit the black community hardest. Michelle Martin speaks with the award-winning journalist Farai Chidea. Plus,
she was desperate. She was a single mother, she was a widow, and she was just trying to get through the day and thinking to herself, okay, I just want my kids to be able to focus on anything besides their loss.
From tragedy to triumph, in a new memoir, TV anchor Zain Asher talks about her mother's extreme recipe for her children's success. Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiane Amanpour in London. The Philippines is bracing for an important presidential election on Monday. Way ahead in the polls is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., also known as Bongbong, and his running mate Sara Duterte. Now, if these names sound familiar, it's because they are. Marcos is the son of Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos, who became notorious for corruption and human rights abuses, and his equally infamous wife, Imelda Marcos, she of the massive shoe collection, who at 92 is still alive and kicking her son's campaign into high gear. Now, they were ousted by a people power revolution in 1986. While the vice presidential candidate is the daughter of the outgoing Philippine strongman leader, Rodrigo Duterte. His rule has been defined and condemned for its bloody war on drugs. Many have forgotten the sins of the fathers, and they are enthusiastically embracing the Marcos Duterte ticket. But correspondent Ivan Watson found that there are still some unnerved by this Back to the Future epic.
Still dealing with the legacy of a brutal dictator after nearly half a century. Bonifacio Ilagan wrote underground newspapers and poetry during martial law under Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos in the 1970s, when the regime arrested and tortured him for 2 years.
I didn't know my threshold of pain, and I kept on hoping that I'd lose consciousness. But I didn't lose consciousness. I endured. I was crying and pleading for mercy.
Itong pangalan ng sister ko.
During that crackdown, Ilagan also lost his sister, Rizalina, a fellow activist who disappeared with a group of friends, some of whom were later found dead.
They impressed upon us that they had the power of life and death over us because it was martial law.
Ilagan now works to ensure the painful memories of his generation are not forgotten. He's also campaigned against the Marcos family returning to power. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., called Bongbong, is the front-runner in the upcoming presidential election.
The Marcoses have succeeded in a big way in not only rewriting history, but in turning history upside down.
Marcos has teamed up with another controversial political name, vice presidential hopeful Sara Duterte Carpio, the daughter of the outgoing president Rodrigo Duterte. His legacy will be dominated by accusations he committed crimes against humanity for running a vicious drug war that left thousands dead. Luzviminda Xiapo lost her 19-year-old disabled son Raymart to the drug war in 2017.
He was so caring and sweet. He was a very good son.
Xiapo said Raymart was abducted and killed after being wrongly accused of selling marijuana.
All I could do is cry and cry for days. I could not sleep.
Xiapo places the blame squarely with President Duterte and says she would never vote for any member of his family, including his daughter. The two powerful new allies in red face a growing challenge from the pink wave, led by the current Vice President Leni Robredo. Her huge street rallies and strategy of house-to-house campaigning pose an electoral threat to the favorites. Her noisy and passionate following of young volunteers, ignited by Robredo's pledge to tackle corruption and help the country's poor. Despite the grassroots support for Robredo, current polls show that the Marcos-Duterte alliance is ahead. Marcos says if he becomes president, fixing the economy will be his first priority.
The failure and success of the next will be how we handle the economic situation. Hindi pa naman tayo post-COVID.
33-year-old shopkeeper Gerard Cruz says he plans to vote for the junior Marcos because he thinks his economic policies will help to lower electricity prices. He also says he won't judge him on the cruelty of his father's regime.
I have no opinion on that because I didn't live in those times. We can't base everything on books.
But forgetting history is what Bonifacio Ilagan fears the most. At 70 years old, he's growing tired of campaigning against tyranny, but he won't give up the fight for what he has always believed in.
Should Marcos Jr. win, I don't think it's going to be the end of our struggle. The struggle will and must persist.
Ivan Watson reporting there. So let's get more of what's at stake. My first guest tonight is political scientist Richard Heydarian. He chronicled the growing illiberal forces in the Philippines in his book, The Rise of Duterte. And when he joined me from Manila earlier this week, we discussed the power shift and its potential impact on relations with both China and the United States. Richard Heydarian, welcome to the program.
My pleasure, Christian.
So you know what? Not many people pay a huge amount of attention these days because of all the world events to Philippine elections, but we know that they're consequential. This one is almost like Back to the Future, bringing up a Marcos son. Tell me what is pivotal about this election and the candidates.
I mean, first of all, this is one of the biggest democratic exercises anywhere in the world, right? Everyone talks about India, Brazil, some of the other large democracies, but the Philippines is also one of the biggest. We have more than 60 million eligible voters, and thousands of positions across different levels of government are up for grabs. But in my opinion, this is the most consequential elections for the Philippines since at least 1969, the last time when a Marcos was on the ballot and won a competitive election. It was a dirty, violent election, but that election in 1969 actually essentially set the tone for the Marcoses to define the Philippine history for the next half a century. And here we are in 2022, another Marcos is on the ballot. And if we're to believe the surveys, he's in a very strong position to essentially pick up not only where his dad left when they were kicked out of power in 1986, but where President Duterte, the outgoing populist strongman president, has left. And the Philippines is really in a very, very, I would say, delicate situation because President Duterte has been able to undermine the foundations of democracy, but he never had the wherewithal and discipline to push it over the edge. Should another Marcos win, he may be in a position to do that. And at the very least, constitutional change could be in the cards very soon.
So Richard, explain to me then, or explain to our viewers, a Marcos being ahead of in the polls in 2022 after, as you say, Ferdinand Marcos, who was considered a dictator, who empowered martial law for most of his reign, who was considered corrupt and quite brutal. You know, he was kicked out by people power. How is it possible that his son, all these years later, is a legitimate candidate and in the lead?
This is possible because of nostalgia. A lot of Filipinos who are frustrated with the status quo. I mean, Christian, let me give you some numbers. Up to 90% of the Philippine Congress is dominated by political dynasties. If you count out of the wedlock kids of some of the political dynasties, 40 richest families took home 76% of newly created growth in the Philippines in recent years. The amount of concentration of power in economic resources is just mind-boggling. And honestly, it has made a mockery out of our democratic aspirations and pretensions for that matter. That is why it made it very easy for Marcos to come in and say, don't you remember during those golden era when my father provided certainty? So this is the authoritarian nostalgia that we see all around the world. And now in the Philippines, the chicken are coming home to roost.
Yeah, the whole idea of strongman rule. And yet, Bongbong Marcos, which is the nickname of the candidate, he is running with Duterte's daughter, Sarah Duterte.
Right.
Again,
Right.
how does that narrative, how is it even a runner in these elections, given how many people in the Philippines seem to want to kind of discard the Duterte years of extrajudicial killings, the economy, COVID, all of that kind of stuff?
Well, believe it or not, Christian, Duterte is still very popular in the Philippines. He still has 60-70% approval ratings. I wrote a book on Duterte a few years back, and some of the numbers I saw were mind-boggling. So if you look at the World Values Survey, Pew Survey, majority of Filipinos have been ambivalent about democracy. A very small plurality have been what you can call categorical committed Democrats, 10, 15, 20%. So Duterte has been able to tap into that zeitgeist, that yearning for a strong man who provides certainty and all. Now, obviously, Duterte has come short on so many fronts. His war on drugs has gone off the rail. His management of the COVID-19 has been more of a mismanagement. The economic contraction has been huge. But this is where it gets interesting. If you ask people, oh, shouldn't that be a reason for us to go back to more liberal, democratic, reformist candidates? They'll say, no, maybe what we want is an even more efficient strongman, right? Hence, what's happened here is actually the reason why Marcos has a lot of support is because presidential daughter, Sara Duterte, kind of a strong woman, kind of like a Le Pen, emerging Le Pen in the Philippines, Marine Le Pen of the Philippines, she decided not to contest the presidency. But let's not forget, the reason Bongbong Marcos is doing very well is because presidential daughter Duterte, Sara Duterte, is behind him. So the opposition is not just against the Marcoses, but against a tandem, the Duterte-Marcos axis. That is why it's so difficult for the opposition to pull off a victory.
So the opposition is basically Leni Robredo, right? And she,
right.
to sort of talk about dynasties and alliances, she is actually Duterte's current vice president. Now, I know they're elected separately, but she is his current vice president. So there's a lot of interlinkage here. She seems to be doing quite well. Do you think that she has any hope of coming anywhere close to winning? She talks about being the anti-Duterte, the anti-Marcos, to really talk about people's cost of living, to bring in a crackdown on corruption and the like.
Right. Well, I mean, Leni Robredo actually managed to beat Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in the race in 2016 when Ferdinand Marcos Jr. ran for the vice presidency. It was a razor-thin margin. The margins were very close, but Leni pulled that off. But, back then, Christian, she was also a political outsider. She came from the provinces also, just like Duterte. She was a fresh face on the national stage. But, over the past 6 years, she has been a big victim of disinformation. The Marcoses never accepted their defeat in 2016, so they have questioned her mandate. All sorts of disinformation has been targeting her. She criticized Duterte's war on drugs for understandable reason. So Duterte has been also attacking her. So she has been squeezing between these two houses of illiberalism and authoritarianism in the Philippines. So when she's fighting right now, she's also fighting against 5 years of disinformation. That explains why she has struggled to really break through, even though she has huge potential to bring hundreds of thousands of people to the grand rallies.
So you talked about disinformation, and we now know that the Philippines, certainly, in ushering Duterte and throughout his regime, has been sort of a lab test case for social media disinformation, the big Facebook narratives, the conspiracy theories. In fact, somebody, a historian, says, think QAnon, but Philippine style. In other words, this current campaign. Talk to us about the influence of not only disinformation, but the social media platforms.
Right. I mean, Christian, I think I and Maria Ressa, both of us have, I think, described the Philippines back in 2016 as a ground zero for a global disinformation industry. You see, the problem is, Christian, back in 2010s on YouTube, there were already these disinformation networks, pro-Marcos networks, but for some reason, there was no effort to regulate these networks of disinformation, and they have really proliferated, and the floodgates were let open, and now that's why we are in a cesspool, sorry to say that, of all sorts of disinformation that unfortunately has influenced the opinion of a lot of people, especially towards democracy, liberal democracy, and Leni Robredo and the opposition in general. And in these elections, Generation Z, the next generation, are coming in. And the worry we have is that they may be even more susceptible to especially new platforms like TikTok, which works very differently. The algorithm is even wilder than the algorithm we have on Facebook and Twitter, right? And Marcoses are doing a very good job on TikTok. They have this sleek, cool messaging there. Bongbong Marcos almost looks like a K-pop star if you go on TikTok. And that seems to be working with the Gen Z, the younger generation. There are 4 million new voters, 18 to 22, and there are tens of millions of young voters. And the Marcoses have been really targeting them because they didn't get them back in 2016.
By the way, do these Gen Z voters, does the Philippines actually teach history in terms of what the Marcos regime was like in schools?
Right. I mean, Christian, actually, I come from the north. My mom is from the north, right? Based on my mom's story, I was born in like Marcos Highway, right? So the north is where the Marcoses come from. Honestly, it was not until I went to the university and I studied in quite a progressive university that I got to know how bad the situation was during the martial law years. Because the basic education in the Philippines, I'm not going to say whitewashes what happens, but definitely underemphasizes the horrors of martial law. That is why it's very, very easy for these alternative narratives of the golden era that we need a strong man and Marcos was our best president ever. It resonates with a lot of youth because our basic education system essentially has really come short. So some of us were lucky to go to progressive Western universities, so we have a better knowledge of what happened then, but that's not the reality on the basic education level.
And now, just to sort of broaden the lens out a little bit, what would a Marcos victory mean to, let's say, China, who are looking very closely, of course, at everything that's going on in their Pacific neighborhood? Let's say the United States, which has a long history of alliance with the Philippines.
Right. I mean, the Philippines has been perched at the center of this scramble by superpowers in the Indo-Pacific region, right? The Philippines has very strategically located bases that will be relevant to America's ability to deter Chinese aggression and hegemonic ambition in this part of the world. But what we saw with President Duterte was that he actually pivoted towards China and tried to downgrade our relationship with the United States in his earlier years. The problem was China took Duterte for a ride. China offered him billions of dollars of investment, offered him concessions in the South China Sea where the two countries have maritime disputes. Guess what, Christian? Nothing came. Forget about debt trap. This was pledge trap. So now whoever becomes the next president of the Philippines, even Bongbong Marcos, who is known to be much more partial to China than other candidates like Leonardo Robredo, for instance, even he will have a hard time selling the China policy that Duterte has been carrying. He will have a hard time of openly flirting with China because Duterte's flirtation with China has been largely fruitless. Then, of course, Christian, the other important thing is the Philippine military. The Philippine defense establishment is largely trained by America. A lot of people, including Defense Minister of President Duterte, are graduates of West Point, right, or New South Wales in Australia. Those institutional linkages with Pentagon and US matters. But Christian, let me emphasize this. It also depends on what the Biden administration will do. I think largely the White House has snubbed Duterte. I understand why. I mean, I'm not sure how many times Biden really bothered to even, dial in the phone for Duterte. But if they're gonna also keep away from the Marcoses, and we know the Marcoses are quite notorious in America. They have a lot of court cases there. There are even suggestions that Marcos may have problems visiting America because of those court cases, etc. But if Biden doesn't engage Marcos, he will make it easier for China to actually charm the next Filipino president. So the Biden administration will have to make some very difficult choices if a Marcos wins. And you see, one important defense agreement that has not been implemented under Duterte is the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. That agreement will allow the Americans to preposition weapons and troops in very strategically located bases close to the South China Sea, those disputed areas. And the Biden administration needs to get that with the next Filipino president if they want to have significant deterrence in the South China Sea against China. So that's why the Philippines is very important. That's why what the Filipino people do, what the Philippine defense establishment does, how the Biden administration approaches a potential Marcos presidency will determine how this competition will go, how the Philippine foreign policy will be, the trajectory of that foreign policy in the years to come.
Richard Haidarian, thank you so much indeed, author of The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracies. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Christian.